Would I rather be feared or loved? Easy, both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. And I think I proved that today at the dojo.
With The Office leaving Netflix within the next year, I decided to rewatch The Office for at least the 500th time, and I realized there's something that I've definitely noticed, but never really talked about on this channel: Michael Scott. Or at least Michael Scott's personality. It's easy to forget what Michael Scott was like very early in the series. A lot of the redeemable qualities that we've come to know and love as Michael Scott weren't exactly prevalent towards the beginning of the show's run. He was boorish, made employees cry, used hateful terms, and was generally a pretty terrible person. His character undergoes a pretty dramatic change even as early as Season 2. And while this has been talked about a bunch by a ton of channels already, we're going to be looking more at how his character has changed a little more specifically, and why it still actually makes sense for his character. So let's go ahead and get into the anatomy of Michael Scott. And of course, consider this your official spoiler warning for a ton of The Office, but I mean, you had to have known that, right? And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. It definitely helps the algorithm not hate my channel. Let's start with Season 1 Michael. In the first season, Michael is, well, the worst. Yes, he's still funny, but unlike in just about every season that follows, there's one major thing that Michael is missing: that tinge of sympathy that we, the audience, have for him. The key difference of what makes Michael in The Office as a whole seem so much different in the first season as opposed to later seasons is that underlying sympathy. Throughout the first season, we see Michael do things that we might see him do later in the show's run, but it just feels so much meaner in the very first season. Let's compare the first episode and what Michael does to a second season episode, Sexual Harassment, and look at the difference in how they're handled. The first episode of the series doesn't have a ton going for it plot-wise, especially when compared to later episodes in the series. Instead, it's mainly focused around introducing as many of the series' main characters as it can, using Ryan as a stand-in for the viewer to get an outside perspective. Oh, Ryan, my sweet boy, how far you'll fall. Anyways, the episode builds up to Michael deciding to show Ryan how funny he can be by playing a quote-unquote prank on Pam, during which Michael tells her that she's fired and she begins to cry. Even after he reveals the absolute genius of his prank, Pam just calls him a jerk before running out of his office. There's no misunderstanding or anything, Michael was really just being mean. Now let's look at Season 2, Episode 2. This episode revolves around Michael Scott being, well, Michael Scott. Michael, the self-proclaimed king of forwards, is being unwillingly reeled in by Dunder Mifflin Corporate, or more specifically, Toby and Jan. But mostly Jan. This is the first time that we see the higher-ups in Dunder Mifflin really come down on Michael, and this, at least to me, kind of changes the character fundamentally. It adds a layer to him that wasn't there before. It makes his character more relatable and takes him from a place being more of a bully to more of a pitiable character. We hear mention of corporate throughout the first season, but really seeing them for the first time tells us that while Michael is the boss, he isn't really the boss. He isn't the end-all be-all in terms of power at Dunder Mifflin. And then, finally at the end of the episode, we see Michael show a bit of change for the first time in the series. When Phyllis is being made fun of by Todd Packer, Michael steps in and calls Phyllis beautiful, before, Michael Scotting it up.
She is an incredibly attractive person. Come here, Chris. Come on.
Michael, come on. You don't have to worry. I'm not
report I'm not worried.
To HR.
You know what? The only thing I am worried about is getting a...
Warning. Demonetization alert. Preparing to resume video.
But why does Michael begin to change? Well, another thing I've noticed throughout much of the early seasons is that Michael seems like he would say much, much worse stuff if the cameras weren't there. And even when he does say something, there are times he does look at the camera and kind of rethink his words and actions. I think that this impacts Michael in a couple of ways that he may or may not even realize. For starters, I think that having knowledge that he's constantly being watched, Michael would begin to be on his best behavior. Kind of like a child being better behaved in front of their parents. And after being under constant watch for years, Michael might actually change what he's saying subconsciously, even off camera. In the same vein, Michael holding back even slightly on what he's saying and watching other people's reaction to Todd Packer, Michael's best friend, seems to show Michael how his jokes can affect other people. Where before he might be too busy laughing at his own joke, now he's more in the passenger seat. But in terms of character, I think the biggest point of change for Michael revolves around his changing view on Dunder Mifflin Corporate as a whole. In the early series, Michael really bends over backwards for his corporate overlords.
That's what she said. Yeah.
There are, of course, a bunch of examples of this, but one of the bigger ones is in Season 4's episode, The Deposition. This episode revolves around a lawsuit that Jan, Michael's former superior turned girlfriend, has filed against Dunder Mifflin. After some terrible stuff is revealed from both Dunder Mifflin Corporate and Jan, Michael ultimately betrays his girlfriend and sides with his employer. And weirdly, this does not end up dooming their relationship. Well, not quite yet anyways. Which is a good transition to the Michael-Jan relationship and how this affected his view on Dunder Mifflin Corporate. The Michael-Jan relationship was rocky from the start, to say the least. But with most of Corporate being off-screen for the majority of the series, we don't really get a good sense of who they are. But with Jan becoming a more regular character in Season 4, Corporate gets personified for the first time. And, well, it's not great. This humanizes Corporate for Michael, who I think for the first time realizes that the people in these positions are just as flawed, if not more so, than him. Then, eventually, Michael and Jan break up in pretty great fashion.
That is a $200 plasma screen TV you just killed! Good luck paying me back on your $0 a year salary plus benefits, babe!
This relationship ends up having a huge impact on Michael and his relationships for much of the future series, but more on that in a bit. All of the humanization for Dunder Mifflin Corporate really culminates in Michael's departure from Dunder Mifflin to start his own paper company, the Michael Scott Paper Company. So ultimately, Michael decided to leave Dunder Mifflin after having to go to New York to be able to talk to David Wallace, the CFO, about his company after Charles Minor, the man put into position that was held by Ryan and Jan, decides to cancel Michael's 15-year anniversary party. This, combined with several other factors, including Holly, Michael's girlfriend at the time, being moved away from Scranton by Corporate, brings Michael to a boiling point where he realizes that David Wallace, and Corporate as a whole, don't really care about Michael or any of the other lower-level employees at all. Michael learns from this and from his short time as an entrepreneur that his caring for his employees is not the norm in business. But it might be Michael's belief in everyone at the office that keeps us in a position of sympathy for Michael. But why was it necessary for Michael to change? Well, honestly, that's kind of an easy question that's been answered by a bunch of YouTubers who've talked about this, but the simple answer really comes down to the length of the show. The British version of the show, which the American is based on, only ran for 2 seasons, which already doesn't sound like a lot, but both seasons were also only 6 episodes. David Brent, the British equivalent of Michael Scott, who the character was based on, does not become nearly as tragic, or pitiable, I guess, as his American counterpart. This is because of the British version's short run. It's difficult to have a character that's hard to relate to and generally unlikable as one of the main characters in a longer running show. So when the American version realized their show was going on longer, they realized that they needed to take Michael from mean to relatable. And the slow transition allowed him to become a more full, more realized character and complete his transformation a few seasons later when Holly is brought back to Scranton.
Holly's coming back here?
Yeah.
Guys, who's Holly?
That is a great question, Aaron. How do you describe somebody who is at the same time an old friend and was a lover and was a complicated part of my past and maybe, just maybe, part of my future?
Wow.
She's one sassy black lady.
Season 7 is really the end goal for Michael's character changes because, well, it's his final season. And Michael's reunion with Holly really shows just how much he's changed from who he was just a few seasons earlier. The first actual return of Holly is in the form of a phone call where Michael is calling all of his exes to tell them he has herpes. Like mouth cold sores, nothing too serious. Holly and Michael begin talking about what happened with their relationship, and Holly tells Michael that he tends to romanticize things. This leads Michael to rethinking all of his previous relationships as he's contacting them all to tell them about his herpes. All of Michael's exes pointing out his flaws over and over, back to back, brings Michael to the realization that he wasn't romanticizing things with Holly, and they really did have something special. A few episodes later, Holly is officially back in Scranton, but she's engaged to someone else. And this is where we see Michael's growth. We see that instead of only caring about how things were directly impacting him, he's a much more empathetic person. Michael initially kind of throws a tantrum when he learns of Holly's engagement, but then realizes just how much he hurt Holly, and decides that it doesn't matter if he's with Holly or not, he just wants her to be happy. Which is a big step up from all the borderline creepy and terrible things that Michael's done in previous relationships. A few episodes later, Michael shows off his long in production masterpiece, Threat Level Midnight.
Threat level what? Midnight. Threat level who? Michael Scorn. Threat level what? Apartheid. Gotta fight it. Free Mandela. Peace, I'm out.
This is another important episode showing Michael's development. In this episode, Michael's movie is shown to the office after Michael worked on it for 10 years. At some point in the past, Michael had shown the movie to the office, but when people laughed at it thinking it was a comedy, which Michael doesn't think it is, he stops the showing and takes the movie back into post-production. This time, the entirety of the office's employees are stifling their laughter, aside from Jim, who is unable to hold it in after so long. After Michael stops the viewing, again, he asks Holly what she thinks of the film, and she's generally unimpressed. They have some words before Michael goes back in to continue the film, and Michael realizes that Holly was right. His movie isn't the cinematic masterpiece it was, and he isn't destined to become some great director/writer. And Holly really helps him get to this understanding, that he doesn't have some grandiose future ahead of him, and that's okay. It's okay to not be famous or idolized because they have each other, and that's the most important thing for them. And that's really the end of Michael's journey, as he gets engaged to Holly and moves with her to Colorado a few episodes later. And in his final episode, we see him do something that might be the biggest sign of growth in the entire series. He doesn't go out of his way to be mean to Toby. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. I reworked my Patreon recently, and now you can watch all my videos on there early for as little as $1 a month. Follow me on Twitter for updates at 10K Bill, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, and of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.